Hi, I'm Doug Keck, and welcome to the Catholic Sphere. You know, each week we tackle topics important to Catholics around the globe with a different host and a different focus. This week our subject is theology, and the topic, Catholic cultural dualism, faith versus politics. Today we're joined by EWTN TV and radio host, the ubiquitous Father Mitch Pacwa. He's with us from his live show set right here in Irondale, Alabama. Also, we've got EWTN's Vice President of Theology, Colin Donovan. As always, he's in our theology studio. Finally, we're joined by my great friend and the founder of the Magis Center and host of Father Spitzer's Universe, Mr. Universe himself, Father Robert Spitzer. He joins us from our studios in Orange County, California. Welcome, gentlemen. And I use that very loosely. Great to have you all back together with us again here on our theology program when we focus on the Catholic sphere of that particular influence. We're in a year here, and certainly in the United States, we're going to be dealing with an election, a major election, a presidential election. So every time that comes up, we deal with the issues related to Catholicism and the intersection not of faith and reason, but politics and Catholicism. So let me ask you, Colin, the title of this, we talk about the idea of dualism, faith versus politics. Is there a separation? Should there be a separation?
Well, there shouldn't be a separation. Politics is supposed to be actually one of the highest acts of prudence, one which we try to judge as God judges, and that's something to bring about good into the society and make decisions that will benefit society. And therefore, for Catholics, those decisions should be infused by faith. Faith in the moral realities which the Church teaches through her teaching, and also love for the human beings that the common good serves. And so unless those two things are brought into the matter, then we can't really say that we are bringing our faith into politics. We're only making judgments according to maybe a party platform or according to our own ideas or the idea of a candidate. Rather, we should be seeking the common good and bringing prudence and charity into that decision making. And for the Church, there are basically two distinctions that can be made. Some issues that have to do with intrinsic evils are not negotiable issues. They are the primary issues of which community life and individual moral life are based upon. And so those have to be paramount, and the Church has enforced this or has taught it consistently. Pope Benedict, in a speech that he gave to European parliamentarians back in 2006, emphasized this particular point, that there are certain areas dealing with life and the dignity of life, of marriage, that means natural marriage, and the dignity of marriage and family life as a cell, the basic cell of society, and also the area of freedom, especially for parents to bring their children up in the faith, in the teachings of the faith, to love God, to love mankind with the love of God. And so the Church is going to put those front and center in all of its decision making and all of the public policy statements that it makes. And those have to be for the Catholic the starting point of discernment on other kinds of things, particular issues. There are many policy issues which require prudential judgment. How do I effect some good that I want? How do I effect a successful economy? You can have a lot of opinions about that. You should be seeking the common good, the good of individuals, the good of the society as a whole. But how to achieve that is something that is subject to political debate. And so those are basically the two categories, okay. Those which are non-negotiable and those which are negotiable or policy-type issues.
Right. We're going to talk more about those specifically in another program as well. Let me go to you, Father Mitch. Do you see the Church's position in relation to politics? We always hear, the idea that there's supposed to be a separation of church and state. So where is it appropriate for a Catholic or for Catholics to be involved in a political sense, and how does their faith impact their politics?
A couple things. First, it's very important for Americans in particular to note that separation of church and state is not in our Constitution. It is a principle that was added into a number of Supreme Court decisions in the late 1940s. Now, while saying that, it also should be noted that when we bring our religious perspective, we are not trying to make Catholicism the official religion. We're not trying to vote that the bishops or somebody would be senators or representatives. We're not looking for an institutionalization of Catholicism. That's good neither for the state nor for the church to have that go on, especially in the modern democracies. That the Constitution does say that Congress shall not establish a religion. The states were allowed to do so, but Congress was not. And we don't want to establish a religion. But what we do see, and this is something that is inherent in Judaism and in Christianity, we see that our purpose as human beings is to worship God, to know, love, and serve Him. And that is our goal. And that that ability to worship God is a primary freedom, certainly recognized in this country as basic. But that freedom to worship and that goal of worship also requires moral thought and moral principles that are usually summarized by the cardinal virtues, including justice and temperance and courage. All these are very important. And while we don't want to put Catholic doctrine and the Catholic Church into an official place within our civil society, and voted in or something, but the moral principles are not extras. They are part and parcel. And when we look back on the history of church members and even church leaders compromising some of the moral principles, we see that it is a short-term search for quiet and peace, but in fact it becomes a long-term source of problems. Think back in the 1800s, those people in the church who accepted church teaching against slavery versus those who compromised and said, well, this is civil society. The church's teaching against slavery is irrelevant. It wasn't irrelevant. It was very relevant. And this is where we have to bring our moral formation as Christians into our civil discourse. And when we don't, society suffers.
Right. Now also, just to follow up on that whole separation of church and state was also designed to protect basically the church from the state, not necessarily the state from the church. So when people think about that, they need to understand what the concerns at that time actually were of our founding fathers, right, Father Mitch?
Yeah, I was going to say, when the phrase was first used by President Thomas Jefferson in a letter to protect the Baptist churches from infringement of their rights by the state of Connecticut, which was a Congregationalist state officially, and they were trying to prevent Baptist church from coming in. It was to protect the church from the state. But when Justice Hugo Black introduced that principle into the Supreme Court decisions in 1947 and 48, you see that it was his attempt to try and protect the state from influence by the church. So there was a shift. And today, that's the way
it gets said.
Hugo Black approach is what people assume you
The
mean.
KKK member, Hugo Black.
Yeah, he was leader of the Ku Klux Klan and a staunch Mason who opposed Catholicism very, very powerfully.
Now, Father Spitzer, you're out in California. We always hear about, obviously, California at this point is a Democratic state, but they also talk about many times, and we hear about it, and there's actually a group on the web who does great work called the Catholic Vote, and there's discussion about the Catholic vote. Is there really a Catholic vote these days? There might have been at one time with the Democratic Party in the old days, but is that even true anymore? And what do we mean by that?
Well, the idea of a consolidated or a group Catholic vote, no, there's no such thing as that. And the Church, of course, has not encouraged its members to vote en bloc. But on the other hand, or the Church doesn't tell people who to vote for. But the Church has, since its inception, as Colin already implied, and as Father Mitch already implied, the Church has always presented guiding principles, on how people should enter into democracy, what principles are important and which ones are not. And so we can say that on the basis of principles, yes, there should be a sort of a Catholic vote. There should be some kind of consensus around a set of principles that the Catholic Church holds dear. And if people call themselves Catholics, they should somehow congregate around those principles, when they're making their selection of candidates, or they're making voting on an issue of one kind or another. Those principles have to come into play. Colin already introduced the idea of intrinsic evils. That's one kind of principle. Those are what you call uncompromisable, or as he called them, non-negotiable principles. For example, you can't kill an innocent person, as in abortion. Those kinds of principles they're non-negotiable. In other words, they should always, in some sense, enter into or affect the way we vote. We as Catholics, because we believe in justice, because we believe that, killing a person, an innocent person, without any necessity whatsoever, if we're to do that it's the most fundamental kind of injustice. The Catholic Church would certainly say, if that's going on, especially on a massive scale, this should be resisted at all costs. It's a fundamental injustice. And John Adams, this is way before Hugo Black, of course, but Hugo Black, you're right, he certainly had the very opposite viewpoint as John Adams. But John Adams felt that human beings in interacting in democracy, he said, look, democracy is never going to survive unless the moral opinion, the good moral opinion, which of course is grounded much of the time on people's religious opinion, is sort of guiding those constitutional principles to fruition. In other words, you can get a framework, you can get a structure for laws and the making of laws and the balancing of legislative power, executive power, and judicial power, et cetera, et cetera. You can take all of Montesquieu's principles and you can put them all together in a fantastic balancing act. But if you don't have any morality, as Adams observed, if you don't have any kind of a way of determining, well, what's right, either on a natural law basis, where various religions can agree, or on what we might call a religious basis, where I form my own conscience by my religious principles. And often enough, as C.S. Lewis pointed out in his great book, The Abolition of Man, natural law principles, natural rights principles do correlate very well with the majority of religions. And so he wrote that wonderful appendix to his book, The Abolition of Man, with 8 of those principles that pretty much govern all religions, that we can certainly bring into the political sphere as Catholics, without any fear of doing something that's establishing a religion or trying to get an upper hand on the political process. Okay. So for all intents and purposes, the answer, if it concerns principles, of course there can be a Catholic vote. of course there should be a Catholic vote, and it's expected that if you don't have something like that based on natural law principles, which are grounded even in religious principles, as Adam said, the democracy will never survive.
Now, Colin, to follow up on what Father was talking about, and as you alluded to earlier, the kind of the non-negotiables and the ones that we have to stand by, there's also, we hear in moral theology the idea that, you know, the idea of the lesser of two evils. Now, that could be seen in straight moral sense from a Catholic and how the church looks at that. But sometimes in politics, it seems like at least that concept is acceptable from a Catholic perspective. Is that true?
No, there is no such thing as the lesser of two evils. You can have a certain proportionality where you have goods which, choices which seem to conflict, and you make a judgment based on if there is, you know, if one choice produces certain evils and the other choice produces other evils, then you do have to figure out, well, which one is going to produce the greatest effect, the best effect. But the starting point is always that the thing that you're doing is itself a true good. Too much in our culture and even in the church in its discussions of moral theology in the last 40 years has been this idea that you're just going to weigh up the outcomes, for example, and you're looking for which will have the best consequence, the most desirable consequence. And then you tend to forget that, well, was the act which you're going to embrace, is itself good or is itself an evil? Or that you see a proportion here that you're weighing and you choose that which is seems to be, as I said at first, the better and way of achieving your objective. These are really religious, you know, applications of philosophical principles like pragmatism and other things, which basically essentially don't speak of conscience and moral goods to be chosen and evils to be avoided. But rather, they're very contemporary and they have no basis in church teaching. But unfortunately, many people are influenced by our culture. And Father talked about the unifying character of the natural law, that you can go back and you can read what Confucius wrote and others wrote in the Eastern philosophies, or you can read the philosophies of the Greeks or the Romans, and you will see that they had certain understanding of the reality of nature and the authority of that reality should have on their own consciences. That the acts that they choose should be in some kind of correspondence to the nature that they're living. Human nature, for example, or the human nature of others. Today we sort of gravitate all to the role of the will. That is that, well, I will to be this way or I will to do this thing. If I'm not hurting anybody, nobody should tell me I can't do it. The only trouble with that is it leads to the dissolution of any social moral framework on which everybody can agree. And I always like to point back to something Pope Benedict said. I think he was still a cardinal at the time. He was visiting the United States, and he noted that the U.S. Constitution, for example, had a better natural law framework for judging and organizing politics and the behavior of the culture than, say, did many of the European constitutions which derive out of Napoleonic era principles. And I think that's true. The only trouble is we've abandoned the natural law principles that were inherent in our own Constitution, in our Bill of Rights, and in the Declaration of Independence.
Right. Well, let me ask you, Father Mitch, going to you on this. Obviously, I heard the term consequence, like consequentialism and proportionalism, which we hear, I think, more in the church again today than we have for the last, let's say, 20 years. It seemed like that concept had kind of gone underground, but it seems to be back again and quite prominent in the church. What is your take on the whole of lesser of two evils? And also the church lets people in the church themselves getting directly involved in politics, like Father Frank Pavone had been involved. Obviously, John McLaughlin at one time years ago. There was even the priest who was with the Sandinistas years ago, who Pope John Paul II confronted. Explain that.
Yeah, there are problems with the clergy being involved directly with rule in politics. It's shown up over the centuries, including in the running of the papal states, where at one point the Pope still is the sovereign ruler of the Vatican. But there was a large part of Italy that was ruled by the papacy. The papacy lost a lot of its influence in those times of its strongest political impact on the papal states. And ironically, when you think of it, when the papacy lost the papal states in 1870, the papacy was able to regain a lot more moral authority than it used to have, because as far as people like Henry VIII and others were concerned, the Pope was the sovereign of just another rival state. That was true for Emperor Charles V, who thought that he had a right to invade and attack the papal states and let the Pope be imprisoned, even though Charles was a strong practicing Catholic on many levels. Few moral issues were weak, but he still saw the Pope as a political power, and the moral authority was diminished. And this is true in the modern governments because as a priest, I am not a priest for the Democrats or for the Republicans or for the Independents. I don't choose a political party that are the only ones I can serve. I offer Mass for Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and any other parties, Green parties, that are at the church. It would be absolutely reprehensible to put a sign out, this is the Democrat Mass or the Republican Mass. That would be reprehensible. And when a priest engages in direct politics, he will be identified with that party. So that's not good. Now, when it comes to a related issue, there are times when the clergy are more committed to a particular party. And
which could be driven by the topic that they're involved with, like on a pro-life issue or something like that. Right?
It could be on a pro-life issue. It could be on immigration.
Right.
Variety of other things. Environmentalism. That would be another, concern for the environment is a moral important issue, morally important. But if I start to let my particular party slide in moral judgment because I like this issue and they're the only ones dealing with it. This party deals with the environment, or this party is for life, and I start to neglect the moral analysis of the other areas in the party. I make a great mistake. That's where that might be one example of being proportionalist, that I care so much about this, I won't pay attention to other issues of corruption. And as Catholics who go to confession are sinners and no sinners, and assume that we're all sinners, the idea that any one party will be without vice and therefore everything they do will be virtuous is dumber than a box of rocks.
There you go.
This is not the way it is. And we have to have Catholic principles that we apply to the judgment of any political party. and all the political parties, including the one I might like best.
Right, and there's also, we can talk hierarchy of truths sometimes, what is more important than another one, which has more direct impact, and et cetera, and where there's negotiables and non-negotiables. Father Spitzer, let me ask you, as a Catholic and as a Catholic priest, John, Manos, our general counsel, every year for the news department has to make sure they understand what we can say and what we can't say from a Catholic perspective, and certainly the church has that. I'm sure you're have been briefed over, not coming out and endorsing candidates and things like that. And then people say, but yet many times in some of the, let's say, black churches over the years, and historically, there's reasons why this existed, but it seems to be much more allowed to be upfront and direct in supporting particular candidates, where from a Catholic perspective, we seem much more leery, and sometimes people say, well, we're afraid of losing our status financially, and we should really stand up for the truth. How does a Catholic balance those?
Yeah, I think you've already intimated it, because the who part of it for a Catholic priest or for EWTN to go out and officially endorse a named candidate, that would probably step over the line legally, because of course, you're telling somebody how to vote. However, you don't get into that problem if you just elucidate the principles upon which they're going to vote. The principles belong to our religion. A specific candidate, it's not our religion. It's, candidates are of various religions. But a set of principles, you can identify them, and you can say, look, throughout the years, this is what the Catholic Church has subscribed to. And here, look, these principles of the Catholic Church are not simply Catholic. Look, they belong to the natural law. They, this principle of justice. In fact, inalienable rights theory came from the Catholic Church. Let's face facts. This was Francisco Suarez in 1620 in his book De Legibus, right? Very important work. He, of course, outlines not only what an inalienable right is, but 4 of those inalienable rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and property. And then he goes on to say why one is more important than the other. So he uses what we call the necessity criterion. So if one right is necessary for the very possibility of another right, then the one that's necessary for the possibility of the other has to be the higher right.
Absolutely. So, and if you want to get more insights on that topic, make sure you check out Father Spitzer's Universe each week. We're just out of time. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Father Mitch, Colin Donovan, and of course, Father Robert Spitzer, for being with us and elucidating us on this topic. And thank you for joining us. Don't forget to join us next week when our host will be Ryan Penny, right here on the Catholic Sphere. See you next time.